What if the most closely guarded secret of the ancient world wasn't hidden in a tomb or buried beneath desert sands, but frozen at the bottom of the earth, beneath 2 miles of ice that hasn't melted in 15 million years? What if medieval cartographers, working by candlelight in monastery scriptoriums, somehow drew coastlines that modern satellites only confirmed in 1958? Coastlines no human eye should have seen for epochs before our species existed. In archives from Constantinople to Cairo, maps still carry the fingerprints of impossible knowledge. Charts that show mountain ranges we discovered last decade. Rivers that flow beneath glaciers we assumed eternal. The map makers wrote that they copied from sources far older, sources now lost, sources that remembered. So before this story pulls you under, consider subscribing, only if you're drawn to histories that refuse to stay buried. The man who created this impossible map lived one of the most remarkable lives of the 16th century. Piri Reis was born around 1465 in the Ottoman port city of Gallipoli, nephew to the famous privateer Kemal Reis, who would become one of the great admirals of the Ottoman fleet. From childhood, Piri accompanied his uncle on naval expeditions across the Mediterranean, learning the arts of navigation, seamanship, and cartography through direct experience rather than scholarly study. He participated in naval battles against Venice and Spain, captured ships, explored coastlines, and gradually accumulated the knowledge that would make him one of the foremost geographers of his age. By the time he rose to command the Ottoman fleet in the Indian Ocean, he had spent decades studying every map he could acquire, interviewing captured sailors from distant lands, and compiling his observations into what would become his masterwork, the Kitab-i-Bahriye, or Book of Navigation, a comprehensive maritime atlas of the Mediterranean that remained in use for centuries. But the map that would make his name immortal, that would spark debates lasting 500 years, was something else entirely. He created it in 1513 in the city of Gallipoli, drawing it on gazelle skin parchment with meticulous care. And he wrote in the margins exactly where his information came from. He consulted approximately 20 source maps, he explained. Some were Arab maps of the Indian Ocean. Some were Portuguese charts of the African coast. 4 were drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, captured by Kemal Reis during a naval engagement with Spanish ships. And some, Piri wrote, were ancient maps dating to the time of Alexander the Great, preserved for centuries in the imperial libraries of Constantinople. These ancient sources, he noted, showed the western coasts of lands across the ocean. Lands that European explorers were only beginning to discover. The map itself survived only in fragments, roughly 1/3 of the original. But what remains has proven sufficient to generate centuries of controversy. It shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a landmass extending to the south that should not be there, that could not be there, according to everything we think we know about the history of exploration and discovery. For 4 centuries, this fragment of gazelle skin lay in the archives of the Ottoman Empire, forgotten among thousands of documents accumulated across 600 years of imperial administration. Then, in 1929, as the new Turkish Republic undertook the massive task of cataloguing and preserving the historical treasures of Topkapi Palace, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann discovered it among a stack of materials being sorted for the new national museums. He recognized immediately that he was looking at something significant, an early 16th century map showing the Americas with remarkable detail for its era. But the true strangeness of what he had found would not become apparent for decades. Initial scholarly attention focused on the map as evidence of Ottoman geographical knowledge, as a document illuminating the exchange of cartographic information between European and Islamic worlds during the Age of Exploration. It was interesting, certainly. It was historically valuable. But it did not seem to pose any fundamental challenge to accepted understanding. The map shows South America in considerable detail, which makes sense given that Piri Reis claimed access to Columbus's charts. It shows the African coast, which Ottoman cartographers knew well from centuries of Mediterranean navigation. And it shows something to the south, a landmass that scholars initially interpreted as a continuation of the South American coast, perhaps the result of errors in calculation or the cartographic conventions of the era that often connected unknown regions in speculative ways. This interpretation held for 3 decades. Then, in 1960, a retired U.S. Navy captain named Arlington Mallory began examining the map with new eyes and new tools. Mallory specialized in ancient maps and their navigation techniques, and something about the Piri Reis map troubled him. The southern landmass did not look like a distorted South America to him. It looked like something else entirely. He brought his concerns to the U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office, which had access to something no previous generation of scholars possessed: modern survey data of the Antarctic continent, including detailed knowledge of its coastline beneath the ice. The analysis that followed would spark a controversy that continues to this day. Working with the Hydrographic Office, Mallory compared the Piri Reis map to modern Antarctic surveys and found what he considered remarkable correspondences. The coastline shown on the 1513 map appeared to match the subglacial coast of Queen Maud Land, the portion of Antarctica that faces the Atlantic Ocean. Not the ice-covered coast visible to modern explorers, but the actual rocky shore beneath the ice sheet, terrain that no human eye has seen in millennia, terrain we have only mapped using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys. The implications were staggering. If Mallory was correct, the Piri Reis map preserved geographical knowledge that should be impossible. Knowledge of Antarctic coastlines as they existed before the ice sheet formed. Knowledge that could not have been gathered by any civilization known to history. The Hydrographic Office was sufficiently impressed to provide technical support for further investigation, and word of the anomaly began to spread through academic and military circles. Enter Charles Hapgood, a professor of the history of science at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Hapgood was not a crank or a fantasist. He was a respected academic who had previously written about the New Deal and whose work on climate and geological history had earned the attention of no less a figure than Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to one of Hapgood's books. When Hapgood learned of the Piri Reis map controversy, he approached it with scholarly rigor and considerable resources. For 7 years, beginning in 1959, Hapgood and a team of students and mathematicians analyzed the map using every technique available. They examined its projection system, its scale, its orientation. They corresponded with the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command, which had cartographic expertise and Antarctic survey data. And they reached conclusions that mainstream scholarship has never fully accepted, but has also never completely refuted. Hapgood argued that the Piri Reis map, along with several other medieval and Renaissance maps showing Antarctic and other anomalous features, derived from ancient source maps of unknown origin. These source maps, he proposed, had been created by a civilization with advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and surveying, a civilization capable of determining longitude accurately, something European navigators could not reliably do until the 18th century with the invention of the marine chronometer. This civilization, Hapgood suggested, had surveyed coastlines around the world and created maps of extraordinary accuracy. These maps had somehow survived the destruction of their originating culture, passing through unknown hands until they reached the libraries of Alexandria and Constantinople, where they were copied and recopied across the centuries by scribes who did not fully understand what they were preserving. Fragments of this ancient knowledge, Hapgood argued, surfaced periodically in medieval and Renaissance cartography, copied by map makers who incorporated them into their own work without recognizing their true antiquity or significance. The mainstream response was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. Many scholars pointed out that the correspondences between the Piri Reis map and Antarctic geography, while intriguing, were not precise enough to rule out coincidence. Others noted that medieval cartographers often filled unknown regions with speculative geography, connecting land masses based on theoretical assumptions rather than actual surveys. The southern landmass on the Piri Reis map, they argued, probably represents nothing more than the southern continent that geographers had theorized since ancient times, the Terra Australis Incognita that balanced the known landmasses of the northern hemisphere. This explanation is plausible. It is coherent. It does not require us to posit lost civilizations or impossible knowledge. And yet, it does not quite settle the question. Because the specific features shown on the map, the indentations and promontories and coastal details, match actual Antarctic geography better than random speculation should allow. And because the Piri Reis map is not alone. Let your breathing slow here for a moment. You do not need to resolve these questions tonight. Imagine yourself holding this fragment of gazelle skin, this piece of another time. It is heavier than you expected, not physically heavy, but weighted with centuries, with the labor of scribes and cartographers and admirals who poured their knowledge onto its surface. Somewhere in its faded lines, its precise compass roses, its notations in Ottoman Turkish, there may be the trace of something older, something passed down through chains of copying we cannot trace, knowledge whose origins we can only guess at. Or perhaps it is simply what mainstream scholars say it is, a remarkable but explicable product of 16th century cartography, its apparent anomalies the result of coincidence and our pattern-seeking minds. You can hold both possibilities without choosing. Some questions are for wondering, not for solving. Now let us move forward in time, 18 years after Piri Reis created his map, to another country, another cartographer, another impossible document. In 1531, a French mathematician and mapmaker named Orontius Fineus published a world map that would add another layer to this deepening mystery. Fineus was a respected figure in the intellectual world of Renaissance France, professor of mathematics at the Collège de France, correspondent of the leading scholars of his age. He was not a sailor or an explorer like Piri Reis, but an academic, a man of books and calculations, and his maps reflected the learned geographical traditions of European scholarship. His 1531 map shows a recognizable world, the Europe and Africa and Asia in their familiar positions, the Americas still incompletely understood, but taking shape as the flood of information from Spanish and Portuguese explorers transformed European geography. And at the bottom of the map, surrounding the South Pole, Fineus drew a continent. Not a vague terra australis, not a theoretical landmass sketched in to balance the northern hemisphere, but a detailed continent with specific features. Mountains running along its coasts, river systems flowing from the interior toward the sea. What appear to be indications of vegetation or habitation in certain regions. The shape of the continent is roughly correct for Antarctica, centered on the South Pole with its characteristic profile. But this was 1531. The Antarctic coastline would not be sighted by European explorers until 1820, and nearly 3 centuries later. And the interior features Fineus drew, the mountains and rivers, would not be confirmed until the late 20th century, when ice-penetrating radar revealed the hidden topography beneath miles of ice. Examine the Fineus map closely, and particular features emerge that deepen the puzzle. The Ross Sea, that deep indentation in the Antarctic coast where the modern Ross ice shelf now floats, appears on the map not as a sea, but as an estuary, a region where rivers flow down from the interior to meet the ocean. In 1531, this makes no sense. How could Fineus have known there was an indentation there at all, let alone depicted it as a river system? Yet when modern scientists surveyed the subglacial topography of Antarctica, they found exactly what the map suggests. Beneath the Ross ice shelf, there are indeed valleys that would be river channels if the ice were removed. Drainage systems that once carried water from the interior mountains to the coast. The mountain ranges Fineus drew along the Antarctic coast correspond broadly to the real mountains that exist beneath the ice, the Transantarctic Mountains and other ranges that we have only mapped using sophisticated modern technology. Not precisely, not with the accuracy of satellite imagery, but with a general correctness that exceeds what random speculation should produce. Scholars who dismiss the Piri Reis map as coincidence must now account for a second anomaly, 18 years later, in a different country, by a different cartographer showing similar impossible knowledge. One map could be explained away. 2 maps begin to suggest a pattern. And the pattern does not end there. 2 centuries pass. The age of exploration gives way to the age of enlightenment. Science emerges as a systematic discipline. Navigation improves, surveying techniques advance, geographical knowledge expands to encompass most of the globe. Yet the far southern latitudes remain unexplored, protected by storms and ice and sheer distance from the shipping lanes of commerce. No European vessel has yet penetrated the Antarctic Circle. The great southern continent remains theoretical, a blank space on maps waiting to be filled. And then, in 1737, Philippe Buache, royal geographer of France and one of the most respected cartographers in Europe, publishes a map that defies explanation. Buache was not a fringe figure or a speculative fantasist. He held official positions, created maps for the French crown, and worked within the established traditions of Enlightenment geography. His map of the Antarctic region, published 4 years before any European would even approach the continent, shows something extraordinary. It shows Antarctica divided into two separate landmasses with a frozen waterway running between them. For 2.5 centuries, this seemed like pure fancy, a geographer filling blank space with imagination. Then came modern ice-penetrating radar surveys, and researchers discovered that Buache was right. Antarctica is not a single landmass. It is two landmasses, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, connected by ice but separated by a deep channel that would flood if the ice melted. West Antarctica is actually an archipelago, a series of islands that would become separate landmasses if the ice sheet disappeared. The frozen sea Buache depicted corresponds roughly to what glaciologists call the West Antarctic Rift Basin, the region where the two landmasses meet beneath the ice. How did Philippe Buache know this in 1737? He could not have guessed it through logical deduction. No theoretical framework of his era would have suggested that a polar continent might consist of two separate landmasses. No observations available to 18th century science could have revealed what lay beneath miles of ice. Buache himself offered an explanation. He claimed, like Piri Reis before him, to be working from earlier source materials. He based his map on ancient sources, he wrote, documents that had been preserved and passed down through generations of scholars. This answer raises more questions than it resolves. What ancient sources? From what civilization? How did they obtain knowledge of Antarctic geography that required technology not invented until the 20th century to confirm? The conventional scholarly response is to dismiss Buache's map as coincidence, to argue that his division of Antarctica into two landmasses was a lucky guess or an artifact of cartographic convention. Perhaps three map makers across 3 centuries in 3 different countries all happened to guess correctly about features of a continent no one had ever seen. Perhaps the human mind, seeking patterns, finds correspondences that do not really exist. Perhaps the whole edifice of evidence is a monument to confirmation bias, a tower of coincidence that collapses under rigorous statistical analysis. But there is another map, one more piece of evidence to consider before we rest. In 1559, a Turkish cartographer named Haji Ahmed created a world map that poses yet another puzzle for conventional explanation. His map does not concern Antarctica, but a different region, the far north, where Asia and North America approach each other across what is now the Bering Strait. On Haji Ahmed's map, there is no strait. Instead, the map shows what appears to be a land bridge connecting the two continents, a strip of territory joining Siberia to Alaska. In 1559, this was pure fantasy as far as European geography was concerned. The Bering Strait had been there, dividing the continents for as long as anyone could remember. Russian and American explorers would confirm its existence in subsequent centuries. The two continents were separated by 50 miles of frigid water, had been separated by that water throughout recorded history. But geological science tells a different story. During the last ice age, when massive glaciers locked up so much water that sea levels dropped by 300 feet or more, the Bering Strait did not exist. The sea floor between Alaska and Siberia was dry land, a broad grassy plain that scientists call Beringia, and humans and animals crossed it freely between the continents. This land bridge existed until approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, when rising seas flooded it as the glaciers melted. No human beings in recorded history have seen the Bering Land Bridge. No historical document describes it. No civilization known to archaeology possessed the knowledge to map it. Yet there it is on Haji Ahmed's map, drawn in 1559, centuries before geological science would deduce its former existence. Who surveyed the Bering land bridge while it still existed? Who recorded that survey and preserved it through 10,000 years of human history, through ice ages and floods, and the rise and fall of civilizations, until fragments of it surfaced in a 16th century Turkish map? These maps force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Either we are seeing patterns that do not exist, finding connections through coincidence and the human tendency to seek meaning where there is none, or these maps preserve knowledge that should be impossible. Knowledge that could only have been gathered by a civilization capable of global survey, a civilization that existed before the end of the last ice age, a civilization that has left no other trace in the archaeological record, but whose maps, copied and recopied across millennia by scribes who did not understand what they were preserving, occasionally surface in the work of later cartographers. Neither answer is comfortable. The first requires us to dismiss an accumulating pattern of evidence as meaningless coincidence. The second requires us to overturn fundamental assumptions about human history, to accept that civilization is far older than we believed, that knowledge we thought was unique to our era was achieved and lost before, that we are not the first intelligent species to understand our planet's geography, but inheritors of fragments from some vanished predecessor. Let these possibilities rest alongside each other in your mind. You do not need to choose between them tonight. Let your eyes grow heavy if they are not already. Let your breathing deepen and slow. The maps will still be there in the morning, waiting in their museum cases, their faded ink preserving secrets we may never fully decode. For now, it is enough to know that the questions exist, that the pattern persists, that beneath the ice at the bottom of the world, something waits, something sleeps, something that the ancient map makers may have known, and that we have only begun to remember. The maps have shown us something impossible, but maps are only one thread in a much larger tapestry, and now we must follow that thread backward through time to the sources Piri Reis himself mentioned, because the Ottoman Admiral was explicit in his marginalia about where his knowledge originated, and what he wrote should give us pause. He stated clearly that he compiled his chart from approximately 20 source maps, some of which dated to the time of Alexander the Great, and others which were far older still. And he specified that many of these ancient charts had been preserved in the Imperial Library at Constantinople, that vast repository of classical knowledge that had survived the fall of Rome and maintained the learning of the ancient world through the long centuries of European darkness. But Constantinople itself had inherited these documents from somewhere else, and when we trace the chain of transmission backward, we arrive inevitably at a city that no longer exists, a city whose destruction represents perhaps the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history: Alexandria. There's the great Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era, by Ptolemy, the first one of Alexander's generals, who inherited Egypt after the conqueror's death. For nearly 7 centuries, this institution collected, copied, and preserved every scrap of knowledge the ancient world possessed, and the numbers are staggering even in their incompleteness. Ancient sources suggest the library held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height, representing the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Babylonian astronomers, Persian magi, Indian mathematicians and scholars, from cultures whose very names have been forgotten. The Ptolemaic kings were aggressive in their acquisition, and ships arriving at Alexandria's harbour were routinely searched for books which were confiscated, copied, and often never returned. The library didn't just preserve knowledge, it actively sought to gather every book ever written in every language from every corner of the known world. And then it was destroyed. Not in a single dramatic conflagration as a popular imagination suggests, but through a series of catastrophes spanning centuries. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, which burned warehouses near the harbour where books were stored awaiting export. The destruction ordered by Emperor Aurelian in 272 CE during his suppression of a revolt. The decree of Theophilus, Patriarch of Alexandria, in 391 CE, ordering the destruction of pagan temples and their contents. The final dissolution when Arab forces took the city in 642 CE, though scholars debate how much remained by then to be destroyed. What matters for our purposes is this: the library contained maps, ancient maps. They're maps that Ptolemaic scholars had collected from Egyptian temple archives where they had been preserved for millennia. Maps that Greek explorers had brought back from their voyages. Maps whose origins the librarians themselves did not fully understand, but which they recognized as valuable and ancient. When the library burned, these maps burned with it, but not all of them. Some had been copied. Some had found their way to Constantinople before the final destruction. Some had been carried to other repositories in other cities. And fragments survived encoded in later works preserved through chains of transmission that stretched across centuries and civilizations, until an Ottoman admiral sitting in Constantinople in the early 16th century gathered what remained and compiled it onto a single piece of gazelle skin. The maps Piri Reis used were ghosts of ghosts, copies of copies of copies, each generation of scribes faithfully reproducing what they received, even when they no longer understood what they were copying, even when the coastlines showed lands no one in their time could visit, even when the precision of the cartography exceeded anything contemporary navigators could achieve. They copied because that was their sacred duty. They preserved because preservation was what civilizations did when they sensed they might not last forever. Let your breathing slow for a moment. Feel the weight of this chain of transmission. Thousands of years of scribes and scholars passing forward knowledge they held in trust. Not all of it survived. Most of it was lost. But fragments remain, and those fragments point backward towards sources older than Alexandria itself, older than classical Greece, older perhaps than any civilization we currently acknowledge. Now let us travel to Egypt, not to Alexandria, which is relatively young in Egyptian terms, but to something far older. Picture yourself standing before the temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt, approximately 60 miles south of Luxor. The sun has not yet risen above the eastern cliffs, and the Nile flows dark and silent nearby. The temple itself is massive, one of the best preserved in all of Egypt, its walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that tell stories most tourists never learn to read. You enter through the Great Pylon Gate, and the first light of dawn begins to creep across the courtyard, illuminating carvings that have waited here for over 2,000 years. But here is what the guidebooks often fail to mention. The priests who built this temple in the Ptolemaic period between 237 and 57 BCE claimed they were not creating something new. They claimed they were rebuilding. According to ancient plans, they claimed they were reconstructing a sacred site whose origins stretched back to the Göbekli Tepe, the first time the mythological era when the gods themselves walked the earth. And inscribed on these walls in texts known to Egyptologists as the Edfu building texts are references to something extraordinary. The texts speak of a primordial island called the Island of the Egg, or sometimes the homeland of the primeval ones. They describe this place as existing in a great expanse of water, far from Egypt, and they tell how this original homeland was destroyed by a catastrophic flood that killed most of its inhabitants. But not all. The texts describe survivors who escaped the destruction and eventually made their way to Egypt. These survivors are called by various names in the inscriptions. The Shebtu, meaning the ones who build or construct, the sages, the builder gods, and they are credited with bringing to Egypt the knowledge that would become the foundation of Egyptian civilization, the knowledge of architecture and sacred geometry, the knowledge of astronomy and the calendar, the knowledge of writing and mathematics and medicine. The texts explicitly state that Egypt itself was created by these survivors as a new homeland after their original land was lost. Egypt, in this telling, is not an origin point, but a continuation. Not a beginning, but a preservation. The followers of Horus mentioned throughout Egyptian royal ideology take on new significance in this context. These Shemzu Hor, as they are called in Egyptian, were said to have ruled Egypt for thousands of years before the first human dynasties. They were the keepers of ancient knowledge, the custodians of wisdom from before the flood. And when the first human pharaohs rose to power, they claimed legitimacy precisely through their connection to these primordial sages. They claimed to be inheritors, not inventors, preservers, not creators. The implications are uncomfortable for conventional Egyptology, which prefers to treat such texts as purely mythological, as symbolic narratives about the nature of divine kingship. And perhaps they are purely mythological. Perhaps the Edfu texts are simply an elaborate priestly fantasy designed to give the temple additional sacred authority. But consider how perfectly they align with what we have already discovered in the maps. A sophisticated source civilization, a catastrophic destruction, survivors carrying knowledge to new lands, the deliberate preservation of that knowledge across millennia. The Egyptians themselves claimed they inherited their civilization from somewhere else. They encoded this claim in their most sacred temples. They repeated it across thousands of years of religious tradition. And when we look at the sudden appearance of Egyptian civilization around 3100 BCE, with its fully developed writing system, its sophisticated astronomy, its advanced architecture, emerging seemingly without the long development period, we might expect we have to wonder whether the Egyptians were telling the truth, whether they really did inherit rather than invent, whether somewhere at the bottom of the world lies the original homeland they still remembered. From Egypt, let us journey eastward now to Mesopotamia, to the land between the rivers where another ancient civilization made similar claims about its own origins. The Sumerians, who emerged in southern Iraq around 4500 BCE, are often called the first civilization, though they themselves would have disputed that designation. Because the Sumerians, like the Egyptians, claimed they had inherited their knowledge from beings who came before. The Sumerian king list, which we touched upon earlier, states explicitly that kingship descended from heaven, that civilization itself was a gift from the gods. But the details of how this gift was transmitted are preserved in other texts, and they tell a remarkable story. According to Sumerian tradition, there was a time before the flood when 7 sages emerged from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These beings, called Apkallu, were described as part human and part fish, or in some depictions as bird-headed humanoids who served as priests and advisors to the antediluvian kings. Each sage was associated with a particular city. Each brought specific knowledge. They taught writing and mathematics, and they taught the observation of stars and the calculation of celestial cycles. They taught the arts of building and irrigation and metalwork. They established the rituals that would connect humanity to the divine. And then came the flood. The same catastrophic deluge we find in Egyptian tradition, in biblical narrative, in flood myths spanning every inhabited continent. The waters rose and swept away the old world, but not before the knowledge had been preserved. The Sumerian texts speak of the Me, a word that has no perfect English translation, but which encompasses something like divine decrees or civilizing technologies, or the fundamental principles that make ordered society possible. These Me were preserved through the flood, kept safe by the god Enki in his underwater palace in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the surface of the earth. After the waters receded, Enki released the Me back into the world, allowing civilization to begin again. The new cities were built according to the old patterns. The new temples followed the ancient designs. The new scribes copied the old texts. Everything that came after was understood as restoration, not invention. Recovery, not discovery. The concept of the Abzu itself deserves our attention here. The Sumerians believed that beneath the visible world lay a vast underground ocean of fresh water from which all rivers and springs ultimately emerged. Enki, lord of the Abzu, was the keeper of secret knowledge, the god of wisdom and magic and cunning. His underwater palace was described as the repository of all the technologies and arts that made civilization possible. When you needed ancient knowledge, you appealed to Enki. When you wanted to learn forbidden secrets, you sought access to the Abzu. Now consider this in light of our Antarctic mystery. A vast body of water hidden from view, a repository of ancient knowledge, a source civilization preserved beneath the surface, accessible only to those who knew how to reach it. The Sumerians could not have known about Antarctic subglacial lakes, about Lake Vostok, with its 400,000-year-old water sealed beneath miles of ice. They could not have had satellite imagery or ground-penetrating radar. And yet, they preserved a tradition of hidden waters concealing ancient wisdom. They spoke of lands beyond the encircling sea, beyond the waters that surrounded the known world. They claimed their knowledge came from elsewhere, from before, from sources they themselves no longer fully understood. They copied and preserved and passed forward, just as the Alexandrian librarians would do, millennia later, just as the Byzantine scholars would do after them, just as Piri Reis would do in his final synthesis. The chain of transmission stretches backward beyond the reach of conventional history. And at every link in that chain, the message remains the same. This knowledge is not ours. We inherited it. We are preserving it for you. Let your mind drift now eastward, still across mountains and deserts to the Indian subcontinent, where yet another ancient tradition speaks of lost lands and preserved wisdom. In Tamil Nadu, the southernmost region of India, there exists a literary and cultural tradition that reaches back at least 2,000 years and possibly far longer. The Tamil people preserve in their Sangam literature references to a landmass they call Kumari Kandam, or sometimes Kumari Nadu, that once existed south of the present Indian subcontinent. According to this tradition, Kumari Kandam was a vast and fertile land, the original homeland of the Tamil people, and the seat of a great civilization that flourished for ages beyond counting. The tradition describes how the sea gradually encroached upon this land, claiming it in stages over immense periods of time. The people retreated northward as their homeland disappeared beneath the waves. They carried with them their literature, their knowledge, their cultural memory, and they preserved in their new home the stories of what had been lost. Modern scholars generally dismiss Kumari Kandam as mythology, perhaps a cultural memory of the actual sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age, when the shallow continental shelf south of India was indeed inundated. And this may be correct. But the specificity of the Tamil traditions is striking. They speak of rivers and mountains and cities by name. They describe the geography of a land that no longer exists. They preserve what they claim is ancient literature from the lost homeland poetry and philosophy from before the flood. The Sangam academies that gave this literature its name were said to have been established first in Kumari Kandam, then relocated northward as the waters rose, finally settling in Madurai, where they continued their work of preservation. 3 academies over tens of thousands of years, according to tradition, each one carrying forward the learning of the previous, each one preserving against catastrophe what might otherwise have been lost forever. The broader Sanskrit tradition offers additional perspectives that converge on similar themes. The Matsya Purana, one of the 18 major Puranic texts, describes the cosmic geography of the world and speaks of lands at the farthest reaches of the Southern Ocean. The Surya Siddhanta, an astronomical text whose origins are debated, but which contains mathematical knowledge of remarkable precision, describes celestial mechanics with an accuracy that European astronomy would not match for over 1,000 years. The text calculates the Earth's diameter to within 70 miles of modern measurements. It describes the precession of the equinoxes with precision. It displays knowledge that supposedly developed independently in different cultures separated by centuries and continents. Unless it did not develop independently, unless it was inherited, unless fragments of a more complete astronomical science were preserved across the catastrophe, passed from teacher to student, from civilization to successor civilization, gradually losing precision but retaining core truths. The ancient Indians knew the Earth was spherical at a time when European cosmology still imagined a flat disk. They calculated the distance to the sun with reasonable accuracy. They understood that the stars were suns like our own, but vastly more distant. They possessed knowledge that does not fit comfortable narratives of steady progress from primitive ignorance to modern understanding. Where did this knowledge come from? The Indians themselves would tell you. It came from before. It was preserved through the flood. It descended from sages who received it from sources more ancient still. Mount Meru appears throughout Indian cosmology as the axis of the world, the cosmic mountain around which everything revolves. In some descriptions, Meru is placed at the center of the world at the pole itself. The gods dwell on its slopes. The celestial rivers flow down from its peak. It is simultaneously a geographical feature and a cosmic principle, the fixed point around which all else turns. The polar symbolism is unmistakable. A mountain at the pole, a center of ancient wisdom, a point from which civilization itself emanated. The same symbolism appears across cultures separated by thousands of miles. The Greek Mount Olympus, home of the gods. The Norse Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting all realms. The Chinese Kunlun, the paradise mountain of the immortals. Again and again we find the same pattern, a sacred center often associated with the polar axis, a source of divine knowledge, a homeland from which humanity was somehow separated. An original perfection that current existence only dimly reflects. Feel yourself settling deeper now. Let the accumulating parallels wash over you like waves. We have traced traditions from Egypt to Mesopotamia to India, and everywhere we find the same essential story told in different cultural vocabularies. There was a homeland. It was destroyed. Survivors carried forward what they could. We are the inheritors of that preservation. We are living in the aftermath of a catastrophe we have forgotten. The pattern extends beyond these ancient civilizations to cultures around the globe, to peoples who could not possibly have been in contact with Egypt or Sumer or India, but who nonetheless preserved remarkably similar traditions. The Hopi people of the American Southwest speak of previous worlds that existed before our own. According to their tradition, we are currently living in the fourth world. The first world was destroyed by fire. The second world was destroyed by ice. The third world was destroyed by flood. In each case, a remnant was preserved survivors who carried forward the memory of what had been into the new world that followed. The Hopi traditions describe these survivors as emerging from underground, from hidden places where they waited out the destruction before returning to repopulate the earth. They speak of flying shields that carried the faithful to safety, of helpers who guided them through the catastrophes of cycles of destruction and renewal that will continue until time itself ends. Norse mythology presents a cosmology where ice and fire play fundamental roles. Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, lies in the north. Muspelheim, the realm of fire, lies in the south. Between them, in the vast emptiness of Ginnungagap, the world was created when ice and fire met. The Norse told stories of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the world would be destroyed in a final catastrophe. The sun would darken, the stars would fall, the earth would sink beneath the waves. And then, after the destruction, a new world would rise from the waters, green and fertile, and the surviving gods and humans would begin again. The cycle would continue. This is not linear history with a beginning and an end. This is cyclical time, eternal return. The wheel turning forever, bringing destruction and renewal in endless alternation. The Zoroastrian tradition of ancient Persia speaks of Ariana Vago, the original homeland of the Aryan peoples. According to the Vendidad, one of the texts of the Zoroastrian scriptures, Ariana Vaego was a paradise where there were 7 months of summer and 5 months of winter. Then, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, brought a curse upon the land. The winters grew longer and colder. Snow fell for 10 months of the year. The land became uninhabitable, and the people were forced to migrate southward to new homes. Modern scholars often interpret this as a cultural memory of the Indo-European migrations as peoples moved from their original homelands in response to climate change. But the specificity is striking. A homeland that grew cold, winters that extended until they dominated the year, a forced exodus to warmer climes. If you were looking for a mythological description of how a civilization might respond to the onset of glaciation, to a pole shift that suddenly made their homeland uninhabitable, this is exactly what you might find. The Greeks told of Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind. According to their traditions, Hyperborea was a paradise at the top of the world, a place of eternal spring, where the sun shone constantly and the inhabitants lived for 1,000 years without disease or suffering. The god Apollo was particularly associated with Hyperborea and was said to spend the winter months there, returning to Delphi each spring. The Hyperboreans were described as a blessed people who lived in perfect harmony, worshipping the gods and cultivating wisdom. Some ancient authors located Hyperborea explicitly at the North Pole, identifying it with the regions of midnight sun. Others spoke of it as a land that had once existed, but was now lost accessible only to the gods and to those few mortals who had earned the right to visit. The pattern is by now familiar. A paradise at the pole, a blessed homeland, a source of wisdom, now lost or inaccessible, but remembered. What are we to make of this convergence? Cultures that never met, that spoke different languages, that developed on different continents, all preserving traditions of polar homelands, of catastrophic destruction of knowledge carried forward by survivors. The skeptical explanation is coincidence or universal human psychology, or the diffusion of stories through trade routes and cultural contact we do not fully understand. And perhaps that explanation is correct. But consider the alternative. Consider that these traditions persist because they remember something real. Not literally, perhaps. Not with historical precision. The details have been mythologized, transformed into religious narrative embedded in frameworks of gods and heroes and cosmic cycles. But beneath the mythology, a core of truth. There was a homeland in the far south or far north or both. It was destroyed by some catastrophe flood, or ice, or fire, or all of these. Survivors escaped and founded new civilizations in more hospitable lands. They carried with them knowledge from before knowledge they could not fully maintain, but could partially preserve. And they told their children, who told their children, who told their children across hundreds of generations until the stories became myths and the history became legend, and all that remained was the pattern of loss and preservation, the pattern of catastrophe and survival, the pattern of wisdom inherited from a forgotten past. Let these parallels settle like sediment drifting down through dark water. You do not need to believe any particular interpretation tonight. You do not need to conclude that Antarctica was once the homeland of a great civilization, or that the maps preserved genuine surveys from before the ice. What matters is the pattern. What matters is that we find the same essential story told again and again across time and space by peoples who could not have copied from each other. Something happened. Something was lost. Something was preserved. And we are the inheritors of that preservation, whether we know it or not. The temples of Egypt, the tablets of Sumer, the hymns of the Vedas, The traditions of peoples around the world all point backward toward a time before. Before the flood, before the ice, before the forgetting. And they all point forward toward us, toward those who might finally understand what they have been trying to tell us across the millennia. But mythology alone does not satisfy the modern mind. We need something harder, something we can measure, something we can date and analyze and verify through methods that do not depend on faith or interpretation. We need to look at what science itself can tell us about what lies beneath the Antarctic ice, about when it formed, and how and whether the timelines we have been taught leave room for the possibilities these ancient traditions suggest. So let your breathing slow and let your mind prepare to shift from the poetic to the empirical, from the realm of myth and memory to the realm of ice cores and radar surveys and the cold hard evidence frozen at the bottom of the world. Now we leave the realm of ancient texts and medieval cartography and descend into something harder, something measurable, something etched into the bedrock of the Earth itself. Because the maps we have been discussing make claims that can be tested, that can be verified or falsified by modern science. And what science has revealed beneath the Antarctic ice in recent decades is perhaps more astonishing than any myth or legend could have prepared us for. Close your eyes if you would like, and let me take you beneath the ice, beneath the 2 miles of frozen water that blanket the southern continent, into a hidden world that no human eye has ever directly witnessed, but that we now know exists in extraordinary detail thanks to technology that would have seemed like magic to the cartographers who drew those impossible coastlines 5 centuries ago. The project was called BedMap 2, and it represented one of the most ambitious scientific mapping efforts in human history. Beginning in 2001 and culminating in 2013, researchers from dozens of nations pooled their data, their surveys, their ice-penetrating radar measurements, to create the first comprehensive map of what actually lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. The technology works like this. Aircraft fly low over the ice surface, carrying specialized radar equipment that sends pulses of electromagnetic energy downward through the frozen mass. These pulses penetrate the ice, traveling through sometimes 2 miles or more of compressed snow and ancient glacial accumulation until they strike the bedrock beneath and bounce back to receivers on the aircraft above. By measuring the time delay and characteristics of the returned signals, scientists can construct detailed 3-dimensional images of the subglacial landscape, seeing through the ice as if it were transparent, revealing a world that has been hidden from view for millions of years, or perhaps far less time than we have assumed. What they found defied expectations. What they mapped challenged assumptions. What lies beneath the Antarctic ice is not a flat, featureless plain scoured smooth by the grinding weight of glaciers, as some had theorized. It is a landscape of breathtaking complexity and drama, a continent as varied and spectacular as any on Earth, frozen in time, waiting in darkness, preserved beneath its mantle of ice like a photograph that cannot fade. Picture yourself in an aircraft flying low over this ice-free Antarctica, seeing it as it truly is beneath the frozen surface, as it once was before the ice came, as it might be again if the ice were to vanish. Below you stretches a world you have never imagined. Mountain ranges rise from the bedrock, not modest hills, but genuine alpine peaks, and jagged summits that would tower over anything in the European Alps, ridgelines that would rival the Rockies or the Himalayas in their grandeur. The Gambutsev Mountains alone span an area the size of the European Alps and contain peaks reaching nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, despite being buried beneath ice so thick that from the surface you would never guess they existed at all. Think about that for a moment. There are mountains taller than Mount Blanc, taller than the Matterhorn, taller than any peak in Western Europe, and they sit invisible beneath the ice, discovered only in 1958 by Soviet scientists during the International Geophysical Year, and still today one of the great geological mysteries of our planet. Because the Gambutsev Mountains should not exist, not in the form they take. Mountain ranges of this type are these sharp, dramatic peaks with their steep valleys and cirques, are typically young in geological terms, created by recent tectonic uplift and then carved by glacial erosion over millions of years into the distinctive shapes we associate with alpine terrain. But the Gambutsevs are old, impossibly old, dating back perhaps 500 million years, to a time before complex life had even fully colonized the land. Mountains that ancient should have eroded away to nothing, worn down by the patient work of wind and water and time into low rolling hills at best. Yet they stand there beneath the ice, sharp and dramatic, preserved as if they were formed yesterday, and geologists still cannot fully explain why. One theory suggests the ice itself has protected them, that by covering the mountains early and keeping them frozen for hundreds of millions of years, the ice sheet preserved their original form like a protective blanket, stopping erosion in its tracks and maintaining the landscape in a state of suspended animation. But this raises its own questions, because if the ice has been there that long, continuously, without significant melting or retreat, then the continent has been frozen far longer than most models suggest. Or perhaps the Gambutsevs are younger than we think. Perhaps they were uplifted more recently through some geological process we do not yet understand. Or perhaps our entire timeline for Antarctic glaciation needs revision, a possibility that few mainstream scientists entertain publicly, but that the maps we discussed earlier seem to whisper. A fly further across this ice-free Antarctica of the imagination, and you encounter landscapes even more dramatic. The Bentley subglacial trench plunges to nearly 8,400 feet below sea level, the lowest point on any continental landmass on Earth, a canyon so deep that if you could stand at its bottom and look up, you would see walls of rock rising nearly 2 miles above you, dwarfing even the Grand Canyon, making it seem like a modest river valley by comparison. The ice filling this trench is some of the thickest on the continent, pressing down with unimaginable weight. And what lies at the bottom of that ancient abyss remains largely mysterious, sampled only indirectly, known only through the echoes of radar pulses that take long seconds to return from those depths. Across the continent, Bed Map 2 revealed a network of valleys and channels that once carried rivers, real rivers of flowing water, carved into the bedrock over millennia, or perhaps millions of years, when this land was green and living and warm enough for water to exist in liquid form. You can trace these ancient river systems beneath the ice, following their courses across the subglacial terrain, watching them merge and diverge exactly as rivers do on any other continent, draining highlands, pooling in lowlands, eventually reaching what would have been the coast to empty into whatever ocean surrounded this very different Antarctica. Some of these river valleys connect to vast subglacial basins, that would have been lakes or inland seas when the continent was ice-free. Bodies of water covering areas larger than the Great Lakes, fed by rivers draining the surrounding mountains, teeming with whatever life existed in those ancient waters. The landscape tells a story of flowing water and living ecosystems and geological timescales that humble the human imagination, all of it frozen now, stopped, preserved in ice like an insect in amber, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to ask how long it has really been there. And beneath the ice, something extraordinary persists. Something that by all logic should not exist yet does. Lakes. Not ancient frozen lakes trapped in the bedrock, but actual liquid water lakes, kept from freezing by the enormous pressure of the ice above them, by geothermal heat rising from the earth beneath them, by the insulating properties of the ice itself, which traps warmth even as its surface radiates cold into space. Over 400 subglacial lakes have now been identified beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, hidden bodies of water ranging from small ponds to vast reservoirs, interconnected in some cases by subglacial rivers that flow even now in total darkness beneath miles of ice, carrying water and perhaps life from lake to lake across the frozen continent. The largest and most famous of these is Lake Vostok, named for the Russian research station that sits above it, a body of water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, buried beneath more than 2 miles of ice, isolated from the outside world for what scientists estimate maybe 15 to 25 million years. Think about that isolation. For longer than humans have existed, longer than most current mammal species have existed, longer than the entire Cenozoic development of our current biosphere. This lake has sat there in perfect darkness, cut off from the atmosphere, from sunlight, from any contact with the surface world, its waters slowly circulating in the eternal night beneath the ice. In 2012, Russian scientists completed a decades-long drilling project that finally penetrated to the surface of Lake Vostok, retrieving samples of the ancient water and the ice immediately above it. What they found both confirmed and complicated our understanding of this hidden world. The water was extremely pure, extremely cold, extremely pressurized, and it contained life. Microbial life, bacteria and other microorganisms that had apparently survived for millions of years in complete isolation, evolving in their dark prison, adapting to conditions that would kill most surface organisms instantly. Now, some of these microbes matched known species that exist elsewhere on Earth, suggesting they were trapped when the lake was sealed off and simply persisted. Others were novel, potentially new to science, organisms that had diverged from their surface relatives over millions of years of isolation, following their own evolutionary path in the darkness. The discovery raised profound questions. If life can persist beneath Antarctic ice for millions of years, what else might be preserved down there? If microbial ecosystems can survive such conditions, could more complex evidence of ancient biology await discovery? And most provocatively, if the ice has been there for 15 to 25 million years, as mainstream geology insists, how did these organisms survive so long? And what does their presence tell us about the stability or instability of the Antarctic ice sheet over deep time? Let your mind drift now with the implications of this hidden landscape, this frozen world preserved beneath the ice like a message from the deep past. The bedrock terrain we have mapped, the mountains and canyons and river valleys and lake basins, All of this existed before the ice came. All of this was shaped by processes that require liquid water, flowing rivers, perhaps even rainfall, processes that require a climate radically different from what Antarctica experiences today. Mainstream geology tells us that Antarctica has been frozen for somewhere between 15 and 34 million years, that the ice sheet formed gradually as the continent drifted into its polar position and became isolated from warming ocean currents. That the landscape we see beneath the ice is ancient beyond human comprehension, a relic of a world so distant in time that even the dinosaurs are relatively recent by comparison. And this mainstream view is supported by extensive evidence, by ice cores and marine sediments and geological formations that all point toward ancient glaciation and long-term ice coverage. But let me introduce some complications, some anomalies, some pieces of evidence that do not fit quite as neatly into this picture as the textbooks suggest. The fossil record of Antarctica tells a story of warmth, of life, of conditions so different from today that they strain the imagination. In the Transantarctic Mountains, the great range that divides East Antarctica from West Antarctica, scientists have discovered fossilized forests. But not just individual trees, but entire ecosystems frozen in place, preserved in rock, showing us exactly what grew on this now frozen continent when the climate permitted life to flourish. The fossils include species of Nothofagus, the southern beech, a tree that still grows today in South America and Australia and New Zealand, places that were once connected to Antarctica in the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. They include Glossopteris, the seed fern that dominated southern hemisphere forests during the Permian period nearly 300 million years ago. They include fragments of coniferous forests, deciduous woodlands, and plants that suggest climates ranging from temperate to subtropical depending on the era and location. Some of these fossils are genuinely ancient, dating back hundreds of millions of years to times when Antarctica occupied a different position on the globe and enjoyed very different climatic conditions. But others are more recent, geologically speaking, dating to periods when mainstream science insists the ice should already have been established. Fossilized wood has been recovered from locations suggesting forested conditions within the last 20 million years. And some researchers have argued for even more recent warm periods, based on pollen analysis and geological formations that seem inconsistent with continuous ice coverage. The fossil evidence paints a picture of a continent that has cycled between frozen and forested multiple times, that has not maintained continuous ice coverage for the entire period. Mainstream geology suggests that has known warmth within timeframes that begin to overlap uncomfortably with the emergence of human ancestors and the maps that show impossible knowledge of Antarctic coastlines. Consider the ice cores themselves, those cylinders of compressed snow drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet that serve as our primary window into past climate conditions. The longest continuous ice core records extend back approximately 800,000 years, recovered from sites like Dome Sea in East Antarctica, where the ice accumulates slowly and ancient layers remain accessible to drilling. These cores show us temperature fluctuations, atmospheric composition changes, volcanic eruptions, and climatic cycles reaching back nearly 1 million years, providing unprecedented detail about recent geological history. But 800,000 years is not 15 million years, not even close. The deeper history of Antarctic ice coverage must be inferred from other evidence, from marine sediments and rock formations, and the kind of indirect proxies that leave room for interpretation and debate. And what the ice cores do show within their 800,000-year record is instructive. They show that ice ages are not permanent. They show that glacial and interglacial periods cycle with remarkable regularity, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, the Milankovitch cycles that push our planet between warmer and cooler states on timescales of tens of thousands of years. During interglacial periods like the one we currently enjoy, temperatures rise, ice sheets retreat, sea levels climb. The current interglacial began approximately 11,700 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas cold snap, and global temperatures reached their Holocene maximum roughly 6,000 to 8,000 years ago before cooling slightly to current levels. Throughout these interglacials, the Antarctic ice sheet has remained largely stable, but there is evidence of significant fluctuations at its margins, of ice shelves collapsing and reforming, of coastlines advancing and retreating in ways that might have exposed bedrock that is now covered once again. The West Antarctic ice sheet, in particular, appears to be inherently unstable, grounded as it is on bedrock that lies below sea level, vulnerable to warming ocean waters that can undercut its base and trigger rapid collapse. Some researchers argue that the West Antarctic ice sheet may have collapsed entirely during previous interglacials, exposing the bedrock beneath and potentially creating coastlines not unlike those shown on the medieval maps we discussed earlier. And now, we must speak of the catastrophe, of the event that separates our world from the world that came before, the boundary marker that divides the Pleistocene from the Holocene, the Ice Age from the current warm period. The Younger Dryas, that 1,000-year cold snap that struck 12,800 years ago with devastating suddenness, appears in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, in marine sediments worldwide, in pollen records and tree rings and archaeological sites across every continent. Something happened 12,800 years ago that traumatized the Earth, that killed most of the large mammals in North America, that ended cultures and civilizations whose names we will never know. That sent shockwaves through climate systems that are still not fully understood. The mainstream explanation focuses on meltwater disruption of ocean circulation, particularly in the North Atlantic, where fresh water from collapsing ice sheets could have shut down the thermohaline conveyor that distributes heat around the planet. But in recent years, an alternative hypothesis has gained traction among some researchers, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the Earth 12,800 years ago and triggered the catastrophic climate shift through massive fires, dust clouds, and the sudden melting of ice sheets. The evidence is scattered but accumulating. Platinum anomalies in geological layers dating precisely to 12,800 years ago, the same signature found at known impact sites, are nanodiamonds, microscopic carbon crystals that form only under extreme pressure and temperature, found in sediments from the Younger Dryas boundary across multiple continents. Melt glass spherules, tiny beads of rock that have been flash-heated to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius and then rapidly cooled. Shocked quartz with the distinctive lamellae patterns that indicate impact pressures far exceeding anything produced by natural geological processes. Each piece of evidence is contested. Mainstream science remains skeptical, but the evidence continues to accumulate and the pattern continues to emerge, suggesting that 12,800 years ago something fell from the sky and changed everything. Now consider what such an impact event might mean for Antarctica. If comet fragments struck the northern hemisphere as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests, the effects would have been global. Dust and debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight worldwide. Fires would have consumed millions of square miles of forest and grassland. Climate systems would have been thrown into chaos, and the shock waves, both literal and figurative, would have propagated across the planet in ways that remain poorly understood. Could an impact event have affected Antarctic ice coverage? Could the massive climate disruption have triggered ice sheet instability, accelerating melting in some regions while causing re-advance in others? Could the West Antarctic ice sheet, already inherently unstable, have partially collapsed during the chaos of the Younger Dryas, exposing coastlines that had been ice-covered for millennia? These questions remain largely unexplored in mainstream research, but they are not unreasonable given what we know about ice sheet dynamics and climate sensitivity. The Antarctic ice sheet is not a monolithic frozen block that sits unchanging over millions of years. It is a dynamic system that responds to changes in temperature, ocean currents, and sea level. It grows and shrinks with glacial cycles. Its margins advance and retreat in response to conditions that vary over timescales ranging from decades to millennia. The assumption that Antarctica has looked essentially the same for 15 million years, with stable ice coverage and unchanging coastlines, may be an oversimplification. A model that works well enough for most purposes, but fails to capture the complexity and dynamism of the real system. Let your breathing slow now. Let these vast timescales wash over you like the ancient seas that once surrounded a very different Antarctica. Feel the weight of geological time pressing down like ice, compressing millennia into thin layers, turning forests into fossils, turning rivers into valleys carved in bedrock, turning civilizations, if they existed, into mysteries waiting beneath the frozen surface. The numbers are almost too large to comprehend. Millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, even 12,800 years, the distance between ourselves and the Younger Dryas catastrophe represents over 500 human generations, 500 lifetimes laid end to end, 500 iterations of birth and death and birth again. We speak of these timescales as if they are meaningful to us, but really they are abstractions, numbers too large to feel, distances too vast to cross except in imagination. And yet, within these timescales, everything we call civilization has emerged. Everything we have built, everything we have learned, everything we have written and painted and sung into existence, all of it fits within a sliver of time so thin it barely registers on the geological record. If we were to compress Earth's history into a single year, human civilization would occupy the last second before midnight on December 31st. A blink, a breath, a moment so brief that anything happening in the seconds before would be invisible to anyone not looking very carefully. And now we must consider the most controversial possibility of all, the idea that has attracted both serious scientific attention and fringe speculation, the concept that refuses to stay buried no matter how often mainstream geology dismisses it. The pole shift hypothesis. In the 1950s, a professor of history named Charles Hapgood proposed a theory that would consume the rest of his life and continue to generate debate decades after his death. Hapgood called his theory Earth crust displacement, and the basic concept was elegant in its simplicity, even as it remained controversial in its implications. Hapgood proposed that the Earth's outer crust, the relatively thin layer of solid rock that forms the continents and ocean floors, could under certain conditions shift as a unit over the more fluid layers beneath it. Imagine the peel of an orange sliding over the fruit while the fruit itself remains stationary. The crust would move, carrying continents and oceans with it, while the Earth's axis of rotation remained unchanged relative to the sun and stars. The poles would stay where they are in space, but the surface of the Earth would shift beneath them, moving some regions into polar positions while moving others toward the equator. If such a shift occurred, a landmass that had been in a temperate zone could find itself suddenly repositioned at the pole, experiencing rapid climate change as it moved into the polar night and began accumulating ice. Conversely, regions that had been polar could shift toward warmer latitudes, potentially losing their ice coverage and exposing land that had been buried for millennia. Hapgood proposed that Antarctica had once occupied a more temperate position, perhaps similar to where it appears on the medieval maps that show ice-free coastlines, and that a crustal displacement event had shifted it to its current polar position, triggering rapid glaciation and burying whatever might have existed there under miles of ice. What makes Hapgood's theory particularly intriguing is who took it seriously. Albert Einstein, in the final years of his life, corresponded extensively with Hapgood about Earth crust displacement and wrote a foreword to Hapgood's 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust. Einstein was not endorsing the theory as proven, but he acknowledged its internal consistency and called for further research into the mechanisms that might trigger such displacement. A frequent rotation of the Earth's crust with respect to the body would be possible, Einstein wrote, if the centrifugal momentum produced by the ice masses were to exceed the stabilizing forces holding the crust in place. Einstein died in 1955 before the full implications of Hapgood's work could be explored, but his interest lent credibility to a concept that might otherwise have been dismissed as pseudoscience. And in fact, mainstream geology has largely dismissed Earth crust displacement, arguing that the forces required to move the entire crust are far greater than any mechanism Hapgood proposed, that the geological evidence does not support rapid polar shifts within timeframes relevant to human history, that the hypothesis fails to explain numerous features of the geological record that fit conventional plate tectonics beautifully. These objections carry weight. The evidence for conventional plate tectonics is overwhelming, based on decades of research into seafloor spreading, volcanic activity, earthquake patterns, and the movement of continents over millions of years. The crust is moving, but it moves slowly, centimeters per year, not the sudden dramatic shifts that Hapgood envisioned. But Hapgood's theory is not the only mechanism by which polar positions might change. There is another phenomenon, accepted by mainstream science, that involves the actual movement of the Earth's rotational axis relative to its surface. It is called true polar wander, and while it operates far more slowly than Hapgood imagined, it is real. True polar wander occurs when mass is redistributed within the Earth through processes like mantle convection, ice sheet growth and decay, or even large-scale erosion and sedimentation. When mass shifts, The Earth responds by adjusting its rotation to maintain balance, which can cause the poles to migrate slowly across the surface over millions of years. The evidence suggests that true polar wander has indeed occurred multiple times in Earth's history, moving continents between polar and equatorial positions over geological time. The question is not whether it happens, but how fast, and mainstream estimates suggest rates of only a few degrees per million years, far too slow to affect Antarctica within any time frame relevant to human civilization. But there are anomalies here as well. Recent studies have tracked the movement of Earth's magnetic poles, which, while not directly coupled to the rotational poles, do provide insight into dynamics deep within the planet. The magnetic North Pole has been accelerating its drift across the Arctic, moving from Canada towards Siberia at speeds that have increased from roughly 15 kilometers per year in the early 2000s to over 50 kilometers per year more recently. This acceleration is not fully understood. The magnetic field itself has been weakening by approximately 5% per century according to some measurements, and geologists debate whether we are approaching a magnetic reversal, an event that has occurred many times in Earth's history and that could have unpredictable consequences for the planet's electromagnetic environment. None of this proves that rapid polar shifts are possible, or that Antarctica was recently in a different position. But it suggests that Earth's dynamics are more complex and potentially more volatile than the stable uniformitarian models of traditional geology might suggest. Whether the maps reveal ancient surveys conducted by a lost civilization that flourished when Antarctica was ice-free, or whether they represent some cosmic coincidence of cartographic error and lucky guessing, they point us toward a deeper question, a question that all the evidence we have discussed tonight, the maps, the myths, the geological anomalies, the hidden landscape beneath the ice, all of it converges upon like rivers flowing into a single vast lake hidden in the darkness. The question is not just about Antarctica. The question is about us, about who we are, where we came from, what we might have forgotten, and what might be waiting to be remembered. The question is whether the history we think we know is complete, or whether beneath the ice of assumption and the accumulated sediment of conventional wisdom, there lies another story, older, stranger, and more consequential than anything we have dared to imagine. Now we arrive at the question that has been building beneath everything else we have discussed tonight, the question that connects the impossible maps to the ancient texts, to the geological evidence, to the flood myths that echo across every culture on Earth. And that question is simply this: if someone surveyed Antarctica when it was free of ice, if someone possessed the mathematical sophistication to calculate longitude and project a spherical planet onto a flat surface with accuracy that rivals modern cartography, if someone sailed the coastlines of a continent that has been buried under 2 miles of frozen water for what mainstream science tells us is millions of years, then who were they, and what happened to them? And where is the evidence of their existence? Because maps do not create themselves. Maps require ships and sailors and navigators who understand the stars. Maps require instruments for measuring angles and distances. Maps require scribes who can record observations and mathematicians who can transform those observations into projections. Maps require civilization, and not a primitive civilization of scattered hunter-gatherer bands following herds across frozen tundra, but an organized, sophisticated maritime civilization capable of mounting expeditions to the most remote corners of the Earth and returning with data accurate enough to survive centuries of copying and recopying through the collapse of multiple subsequent civilizations. This is the implication that mainstream archaeology cannot easily address. This is why the maps remain so troubling, because they imply capabilities that we have been taught did not exist. Capabilities that, according to the conventional timeline of human development, could not have existed. And yet, the maps exist. The accuracy exists. The knowledge exists encoded in gazelle skin parchment and medieval vellum and crumbling paper charts, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough to see what they reveal. In 1995, a British journalist named Graham Hancock published a book called Fingerprints of the Gods that would become one of the most controversial and widely read alternative history texts of the modern era. And whatever you think of Hancock's conclusions, whatever the academic establishment says about his methodology, his central observation remains difficult to dismiss entirely, which is simply that the ancient world possessed knowledge that seems to have come from somewhere. Knowledge that appears suddenly and fully formed, rather than developing gradually through the slow accumulation of trial and error that characterizes most human technological progress. The Sumerians emerged from apparent obscurity with writing and mathematics and astronomy and architecture and agriculture and metallurgy all seemingly in place. The Egyptians built the Great Pyramid during the 4th dynasty with engineering precision that they never equaled again in the subsequent 2,000 years of their civilization, as if they were working from inherited knowledge they did not fully understand. Rather than developing techniques through experimentation, the maritime maps we have been discussing show a pattern of degradation over time, becoming less accurate as centuries pass, rather than more accurate as you would expect if knowledge were accumulating rather than being slowly lost. And Hancock's hypothesis, expanded and refined over 3 decades of subsequent research and writing, is that this pattern of apparent inheritance makes sense if we assume the existence of a sophisticated predecessor civilization. Be a global maritime culture that was largely destroyed by the catastrophic events of the Younger Dryas period, around 12,800 years ago, with survivors scattering across the globe, carrying fragments of knowledge that they passed to the nascent civilizations of the early Holocene, becoming the culture heroes and civilizing gods remembered in myth. The Apkallu fish sages of Mesopotamia, the followers of Horus in Egypt, the Viracocha figures of South America, wise beings who appeared after catastrophe and taught the arts of civilization to peoples struggling to rebuild. This hypothesis remains deeply controversial in academic circles, and I want to be clear about that, because intellectual honesty matters even when we are exploring the margins of accepted knowledge. Mainstream archaeologists point out that the evidence for gradual development exists even if it is sometimes incomplete, that the apparent sudden emergence of civilizations can reflect gaps in the archaeological record rather than actual sudden appearance, that the anomalous maps can be explained through cartographic conventions of the era or through coincidental accuracy rather than requiring ancient surveys. These are legitimate objections, and they deserve serious consideration. But there is also a tendency in academic culture to dismiss anomalies rather than investigate them, to explain away rather than explain, to protect consensus rather than follow evidence wherever it leads. And the maps remain anomalous. The knowledge they contain remains difficult to account for through conventional explanations. And the question of who surveyed Antarctica remains unanswered by any explanation that does not invoke either extraordinary coincidence or extraordinary lost knowledge. So let us continue following this thread, not because we are certain it leads to truth, but because we are curious and the night is long and sleep comes easier when the mind has been allowed to wander through possibilities rather than being constrained to certainties. Consider what would be required to create the source maps that Piri Reis claimed to have copied. Consider the technological and organizational sophistication implied by accurate cartography of coastlines on the opposite side of the planet. From any known ancient civilization, to survey a coastline, you must sail along it, which requires ships capable of open ocean navigation, which requires understanding of winds and currents and celestial navigation, which requires instruments for measuring latitude through stellar observation. You must calculate distances somehow, through dead reckoning or through more sophisticated methods. You must record your observations in a form that can be transmitted to others. You must have a mathematical framework for converting your observations into a coherent map. And if you are mapping a spherical planet onto a flat surface, you must understand spherical trigonometry and projection mathematics. The Piri Reis map uses what cartographers call an azimuthal equidistant projection, centered somewhere in the vicinity of Egypt. This is a sophisticated projection that preserves accurate distances from the center point while distorting distances elsewhere. Creating it requires understanding that the Earth is a sphere and understanding the mathematical relationships that govern how spherical surfaces translate to flat ones. And the remarkable thing about the Piri Reis map is not just that it shows Antarctica, but that it shows Antarctica in correct spatial relationship to South America and Africa, with the distances and angles approximately correct, suggesting that whoever created the ultimate source material understood not just local coastlines, but global geography, understood the relative positions of continents separated by thousands of miles of ocean, understood enough to create an integrated map of substantial portions of the planet. The longitude problem makes this even more remarkable. For most of human history, determining longitude while at sea was essentially impossible because longitude requires knowing the precise time at a reference location, while simultaneously measuring local time through celestial observation. And until the development of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century, there was no reliable way to keep precise time aboard a ship at sea. This is why European exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries produced maps with reasonably accurate latitude but wildly inaccurate longitude. This is why the search for a method of determining longitude was one of the most pressing scientific challenges of the early modern period, with substantial prizes offered by multiple governments. And yet, some of the ancient source material appears to have reasonably accurate longitude. Not perfect, certainly, but far better than should be possible, without either extremely sophisticated timekeeping or alternative methods we do not fully understand. Some researchers have proposed that a global network of astronomical observations could theoretically allow longitude calculation through the timing of lunar eclipses or other celestial events visible from multiple locations simultaneously. But this would require coordinated observation across vast distances and sophisticated mathematical reduction of the data. It would require, in other words, precisely the kind of organized scientific civilization that conventional history says did not exist. So we face a choice. Either the accuracy is coincidental, arising from the accumulation of errors that happen to cancel out in fortunate ways, or someone somewhere, somewhen possessed capabilities we did not think existed, and the maps alone cannot tell us which explanation is correct. But they can point us toward other evidence, toward other anomalies, toward the physical remains of what might have been. Now let your breathing slow for a moment. Let the mathematical complexities fade into the background as we shift our attention from speculation about who might have existed to physical evidence of what actually remains. Let us travel to southeastern Turkey, to a hilltop that has become perhaps the most important archaeological site discovered in the past century. A place that has forced archaeologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human prehistory, a place called Göbekli Tepe. And the site was first noticed in 1963 during a survey by Istanbul University and the University of Chicago. But the initial assessment dismissed the stone slabs protruding from the hilltop as medieval grave markers, and no excavation was undertaken. It was not until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site and recognized what the earlier survey had missed, that these were not grave markers, but the tops of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, the largest weighing over 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, and that they dated not to the medieval period, but to approximately 9,600 BCE, making them roughly 11,600 years old, built at the end of the Younger Dryas period, just as the catastrophic cold snap was ending and the world was warming back to habitable conditions. And built not by sophisticated city dwellers with agricultural surplus and specialized labor forces, but apparently by hunter-gatherers who should not have possessed the organizational capacity or technological capability to quarry transport and erect massive stone monuments. Göbekli Tepe should not exist according to the conventional narrative of human development. It predates the supposed invention of agriculture by at least 1,000 years. It predates the first cities by 5,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. And yet, there it stands, circle after circle of massive carved pillars arranged in precise geometric patterns, oriented to astronomical alignments, decorated with sophisticated artwork that required skilled craftspeople working over extended periods. And all of it deliberately buried under tons of fill dirt around 8,000 BCE, for reasons we do not understand. The implications of Göbekli Tepe continue to reverberate through archaeology, because it inverts the assumed sequence of human cultural development. The conventional narrative held that agriculture came first, that reliable food surplus from farming allowed populations to settle in permanent locations, that settled populations grew larger and developed social hierarchies and specialized labor, that surplus and specialization allowed the construction of monuments and temples, that religion was in essence a luxury made possible by agricultural plenty. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite sequence. It suggests that the desire to gather for religious or ceremonial purposes came first, that the need to feed the people who gathered to build and maintain these sites drove the development of agriculture, that monument building preceded settled agriculture. Rather than following from it, Klaus Schmidt himself proposed this interpretation before his death in 2014, arguing that the belly built the temple, meaning that the logistics of feeding construction workers created the pressure to cultivate crops more intensively, eventually leading to full domestication. This is a profound reordering of cause and effect in human prehistory, and it suggests that we may have fundamentally misunderstood how and why civilization emerged. But for our purposes tonight, the most significant aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not the reordering of the archaeological sequence, but the sophistication of what was built and the timing of when it was built. Because Göbekli Tepe appears almost immediately after the Younger Dryas catastrophe, it appears at precisely the moment when, according to the cyclical view of history we have been exploring, survivors of an earlier civilization would have been struggling to rebuild and preserve knowledge. And it was deliberately buried, carefully filled in with dirt and debris, in a process that must have taken significant effort, as if the builders wanted to preserve the site for future discovery, wanted to protect it from the erosion and destruction that would eventually reduce exposed monuments to rubble, wanted to leave a message for someone who would come later, and similar sites are now being discovered across the region. Karahan Tepe, with its carved stone heads and ritual chambers dating to the same period. Bonkuklu Tala, with its thousands of stone beads and evidence of communal ritual activity, a whole complex of monuments emerging from the ground in southeastern Turkey, all dating to the centuries immediately following the Younger Dryas, all suggesting that something significant was happening in this region at this time. Some major cultural efflorescence that the conventional narrative of slow, gradual development cannot easily explain. One pillar at Göbekli Tepe has attracted particular attention from researchers interested in catastrophe and preservation. Pillar 43 in Enclosure D is covered with carved reliefs, including vultures, a scorpion, and various other figures. And some researchers have proposed that this pillar encodes astronomical information, that the animal figures represent constellations, and that their arrangement commemorates a specific celestial configuration, possibly the configuration that existed at the time of the Younger Dryas onset around 12,800 years ago. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains controversial with many archaeologists dismissing it as pattern matching and projection, then Pillar 43 is not merely decorative, but commemorative, a record carved in stone of the cosmic event that devastated the world, a warning left for future generations. This interpretation cannot be proven definitively, but it aligns with the pattern we have seen throughout our exploration tonight, the pattern of ancient peoples encoding important information in durable materials, preserving knowledge through catastrophe, and passing forward what they could not fully explain but felt was too important to lose. And this brings us to the Antarctic possibility, because if we accept even provisionally the hypothesis that a sophisticated maritime civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, if we accept that this civilization possessed the navigational and cartographic capabilities implied by the anomalous maps, if we accept that catastrophic events destroyed most of this civilization, leaving only scattered survivors who became the teachers and culture heroes of subsequent societies, then we must ask where this civilization was centered, where its cities were, where its monuments were, where the evidence of its existence might still remain. And one possibility that researchers have proposed is that this civilization flourished in Antarctica during a period when that continent was not covered in ice. when it occupied a position on the globe that made it habitable, when its coastlines were the green and fertile lands shown on the impossible maps. This possibility seems absurd at first glance, because we know Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. We know it has been positioned over the South Pole for far longer than humans have existed. We know that even if somehow a civilization could have existed there, the evidence would be buried under ice so deep and so old that recovery would be impossible. But each of these certainties deserves examination. The ice cores tell us about the last several 100,000 years of climate history, but they cannot tell us about what might have existed before the ice began accumulating in a given location. The position of Antarctica over the South Pole assumes the stability of the current continental configuration. But we know the continents drift, and we know the magnetic poles wander, and some researchers have proposed more dramatic crustal displacement events that could have repositioned land masses more rapidly than conventional geology allows. And the impossibility of recovery assumes the ice is permanent and unchanging. But we are watching the ice change before our eyes, watching glaciers retreat and ice shelves collapse, and frozen landscapes reveal their secrets. Let us consider for a moment what an ice-free Antarctica might have been like. What kind of environment might have existed if the maps show something real? The Orontius Fineus map shows mountain ranges with rivers flowing toward the coast. The Buache map shows the separation between East and West Antarctica that modern radar has confirmed. If we remove the ice and imagine the continent at a more temperate latitude, we see a landmass roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, with mountain ranges and broad river valleys, with extensive coastline and protected harbors, with the kind of diverse geography that supported the development of civilizations elsewhere. The Gambutsef Mountains alone rise to heights comparable to the Alps. If ice-free, they would have provided the alpine valleys and snowmelt rivers that nurtured so many ancient cultures. The massive canyon recently discovered beneath the ice rivals the Grand Canyon in scale. At lower elevations and without ice cover, it would have been a fertile river valley. We have no way of knowing what might have existed there because we cannot reach it, cannot excavate it, cannot study it with any of the tools that have revealed the secrets of other ancient lands. The inaccessibility of Antarctic archaeology is total and absolute in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate. Even reaching Antarctica requires weeks of sea voyage or expensive flights to remote stations. Even surviving on the surface requires elaborate infrastructure and constant supply, and that is just to exist on top of the ice. Beneath the ice, everything is sealed away behind pressure and cold that no current technology can penetrate for systematic exploration. We have sent radar waves through the ice and mapped the general topography of what lies beneath. We have drilled cores through the ice to sample the ancient air and water trapped in deep layers. But we have not excavated, have not searched, have not looked for the kind of evidence that would reveal whether anyone ever lived there. We have assumed the answer is no, because how could it be yes? And so we have not looked. And because we have not looked, we have not found. And because we have not found, we continue to assume the answer is no. The logic is circular, but feels compelling, because the alternative seems too strange to consider seriously. But consider what preservation in ice might mean. Consider the mammoths of Siberia frozen so rapidly that plant material remains in their stomachs undigested. frozen so completely that their flesh remained edible after 10,000 years. Consider what rapid ice coverage might preserve, not just bones and shells the way normal archaeological sites preserve organic remains, but soft tissue and fabric and wood, and perhaps even documents written on durable materials. If a civilization existed in Antarctica, and if it was rapidly covered by ice through whatever mechanism, the evidence would not have decayed the way evidence decays in normal environments exposed to oxygen and bacteria and water and sun. The evidence would be frozen in place, waiting, preserved as completely as the mammoths of the Siberian permafrost, preserved as completely as the samples we have retrieved from the deep Antarctic ice cores, as preserved perhaps in forms we cannot even anticipate because we have never found artifacts in such conditions. In 2018, researchers discovered a massive impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland, a crater 31 kilometers wide that was completely invisible until ice-penetrating radar revealed its circular rim and central peak. The impact that created this crater occurred somewhere between 12,000 years ago and 3 million years ago, according to current estimates. The dating is imprecise because we cannot reach the site to collect samples. We cannot excavate the floor of the crater. We cannot determine with precision when the asteroid or comet struck. But we know it was there, waiting beneath the ice for our technology to become sophisticated enough to detect it, unknown and unsuspected until 2018. And if a crater 31 kilometers wide could hide beneath Greenland ice until 3 years ago, what else might be hiding beneath the far vaster ice sheets of Antarctica? What features might lie there that we have not yet detected because our surveys are incomplete, because our technology is limited, because we have not yet looked in the right places with the right instruments? The ice will not keep its secrets forever. This is perhaps the most significant realization emerging from our current moment in history. The ice is melting. The glaciers are retreating. The ice shelves are collapsing into the sea. What was sealed away for millennia is beginning to emerge. In the Alps, the retreat of glaciers has revealed artifacts from the Bronze Age, and earlier weapons and tools and human remains preserved in ice for thousands of years. In the Andes, melting ice has exposed ancient ritual sites at elevations previously thought inaccessible to pre-modern peoples. In Siberia, thawing permafrost is releasing not just mammoths, but ancient viruses and bacteria, diseases that have been frozen since before recorded history. The ice is a time capsule, and we are opening it whether we intend to or not. And Antarctica holds more ice than anywhere else on Earth. 2/3 of the planet's fresh water locked in those frozen sheets. And as climate change accelerates and the ice continues to retreat, as the sheets destabilize and the shelves collapse and the glaciers pour their contents into the rising seas, we may learn things we never expected to learn, may discover evidence we never expected to discover, may face answers to questions we were not sure we wanted to ask. So, here is where our story takes its most unsettling turn. Here is where the ancient mystery connects to the present danger. Here is where the lost civilization question stops being merely academic speculation about the deep past and becomes instead a question about what we might actually discover as our world transforms. Because the same forces that threaten our civilization with rising seas and disrupted climate may be the forces that reveal the evidence of previous civilizations. The same melting ice that will redraw our coastlines and displace our populations may be the ice that has preserved secrets for millennia, and we may be the generation that learns whether the maps were fantasy or memory, whether the ancient texts were mythology or history, whether we are the first advanced civilization on this planet, or merely the latest in a cycle we are only beginning to understand. Now we must speak of the present moment, of the ice that has kept its secrets for millennia, beginning at last to release its grip, and of what this might mean for everything we have been contemplating together through this long night. The numbers are stark, and they are accelerating in ways that scientists did not predict even a decade ago. Antarctica is losing ice at a rate of approximately 150 billion tons per year, and that rate has tripled since 2012. The great glaciers that flow from the interior toward the sea are speeding up, their tongues carving enormous icebergs into warming waters, their bases undermined by currents that grow warmer with each passing season. The Thwaites Glacier alone, sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier by researchers who study its precarious grip on the bedrock beneath, holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by 2 feet if it collapses entirely, and it is showing signs of instability that alarm even the most cautious glaciologists. The Pine Island Glacier is retreating at a rate of more than a mile per year. The ice shelves that once buttressed these great rivers of frozen water are thinning, cracking, breaking away in pieces the size of small countries. In 2021, an iceberg larger than Rhode Island carved from the Brunt ice shelf. In 2017, the Larsen Sea ice shelf released a trillion-ton iceberg the size of Delaware. These are not gradual processes measured in geological time. These are changes happening within human lifespans, within decades, within years, within the time it takes a child to grow to adulthood. And here is what should give us pause as we contemplate the ancient maps and the impossible knowledge they seem to contain. As the ice retreats, it reveals things. Already, in regions where glaciers have pulled back from their maximum extents, researchers have discovered ancient lake beds that existed before the ice advanced, forests of fossilized trees that grew in Antarctica when it was warmer, pollen records that tell of flowering plants and temperate climates, mosses that were flash frozen and preserved in states so perfect that they can still be revived in laboratories, brought back to life after thousands of years of suspended animation. In 2019, researchers drilling through the ice discovered fossil fragments of ancient forests in the Transantarctic mountains. It evidence of a time when trees grew where now only ice exists. In the dry valleys, those strange ice-free regions where conditions are so harsh that they serve as analogues for Mars, scientists have found mummified seals that wandered inland and died thousands of years ago, their bodies preserved by the cold and aridity waiting to be found. And these are only the discoveries made at the margins, in the small percentage of Antarctica that is accessible to researchers with current technology. 98% of the continent remains buried beneath ice, averaging more than a mile in thickness, in some places reaching depths of nearly 3 miles. We have mapped what lies beneath, using ice-penetrating radar and seismic surveys, revealing the mountains and valleys and ancient riverbeds that sleep in frozen darkness. But mapping is not the same as seeing, and seeing is not the same as touching, and touching is not the same as knowing what artifacts or structures or evidence might be preserved there, frozen in place, since the ice first advanced over a world that was once very different from the one we know. The very force that threatens our civilization, the warming that melts the ice and raises the seas and destabilizes the climate systems upon which we depend, this same force might reveal evidence of civilizations that came before, that rose and fell while the ice advanced and retreated through cycles we are only beginning to understand. There is a strange poetry in this, a kind of cosmic irony. We are changing the climate in ways that might expose our own fragility by revealing the remains of those who were fragile before us. The ice that has kept its secrets might surrender them, just as we face the consequences of our own civilizational choices. And so, there is a race, largely unspoken, but very real among the scientists who study these things. A race to survey and understand and document what the retreating ice reveals before it is lost to other forces, before rising seas cover the coastal areas, before the chaos of climate disruption makes research impossible, before whatever lies beneath is exposed to the elements and begins the long process of decay that the ice had prevented. Let your mind drift with this for a moment. Imagine what might be waiting. Not necessarily cities or monuments, though we cannot rule such things out entirely, but perhaps something subtler, stone tools that predate any known human presence on the continent. The carved markings on rocks that were exposed when the ice first advanced and then preserved in perfect stillness for millennia. Artifacts of bone or antler or worked stone that would tell us humans were there, doing human things, making human objects, living human lives in a place and time when conventional history says no humans existed. Or perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps the ice covers only bare rock and ancient sediment, and the fossils of long-extinct animals and plants that tell us only what we already know, that Antarctica was once warm, was once green, was once part of the living world, but was never home to anything we would recognize as civilization. We cannot know until we look, and looking is becoming possible in ways it never was before. But here, we must address something that swirls around Antarctica, like the winds that circle the continent, a miasma of speculation and suspicion that we should neither dismiss entirely nor embrace uncritically. Antarctica is the only continent on Earth governed entirely by international treaty. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed initially by 12 nations and now by 54, established that the continent would be used for peaceful purposes only, that military activity would be prohibited, that scientific research would be free and its results shared, that territorial claims would be frozen in place, neither abandoned nor pursued. This was an unprecedented act of international cooperation, achieved at the height of the Cold War when the United States and Soviet Union were locked in nuclear standoff and could agree on almost nothing else. And yet, they agreed on this. They agreed that Antarctica would be different, would be preserved, would be protected from the exploitation and conflict that had marked human interaction with every other landmass on Earth. For over 6 decades, the treaty has held. No nation has established permanent military presence. No nation has exploited the mineral resources that almost certainly lie beneath the ice. Scientific stations operated by dozens of countries conduct research in relative harmony, sharing data and resources in ways that would be unthinkable on any other continent. This is remarkable. This is unprecedented. And precisely because it is unprecedented, It has attracted speculation about ulterior motives, hidden agendas, secrets being kept from the public by governments who agree on nothing else but somehow agree that Antarctica must remain off-limits to ordinary people and ordinary scrutiny. The conspiracy theories are numerous and varied. Some claim that the ice hides the entrance to a hollow earth, that Admiral Richard Byrd discovered something during his expeditions in the 1940s and 50s that terrified the governments of the world into sealing the continent away from investigation. Others claim that Nazi Germany established a secret base in Antarctica during World War II, that this base continued to operate after the war, that Operation High Jump in 1946 was actually a military assault on this base that ended in unexpected defeat. Still others point to the unusual number of prominent figures who visited Antarctica in 2016 and 2017, including then Secretary of State John Kerry, Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, Apollo astronaut Buzz Aldrin, and Prince Harry of Britain, suggesting that something was discovered that required personal verification by leaders and luminaries. We should be clear about what can be verified and what cannot. There is no credible evidence for hollow Earth theories or hidden Nazi bases or extraterrestrial installations beneath the ice. The visits by prominent figures, while unusual in their timing and frequency, have mundane explanations involving scientific dedications, ecological tourism, and diplomatic symbolism during a period when climate change was bringing renewed attention to polar regions. The Antarctic Treaty exists for understandable reasons, preserving a continent for scientific research while preventing the territorial conflicts that would inevitably arise if nations began exploiting its resources. The simplest explanation is often the correct one, and the simplest explanation for Antarctic cooperation is that it serves everyone's interests to maintain the status quo. And yet, there are genuine mysteries that do not require conspiracy to find intriguing. There are magnetic anomalies beneath the ice that have never been satisfactorily explained. There are regions where radar penetration has revealed structures or formations that do not match expectations for natural geological features. There are areas where access is restricted beyond what scientific concerns would seem to require. The Wilkes Land Gravity Anomaly, discovered in 2006, suggests something massive buried beneath the ice, possibly an impact crater from an asteroid strike that may have contributed to an extinction event millions of years ago, or possibly something else entirely. We do not know. We cannot know without drilling through miles of ice to investigate. And until we can do that, until technology advances to the point where excavation beneath the ice sheet becomes possible, Antarctica will keep its secrets. The treaty that protects the continent also, whether intentionally or not, prevents the kind of unrestricted exploration that might reveal what lies beneath. This is not proof of conspiracy. It may simply be coincidence or prudence, or the natural result of protecting a fragile environment from exploitation. But it does mean that the questions remain open, that the mysteries persist, that whatever sleeps beneath the ice continues sleeping undisturbed. Let your breathing slow now as we move toward the deeper implications of everything we have contemplated together through this long journey through time and ice and memory. If what we have discussed tonight has any validity, if the maps really do encode knowledge that should have been impossible for their makers to possess, If Antarctica really did support conditions conducive to complex life more recently than conventional timelines suggest, if there really are artifacts or structures or evidence of previous civilizations preserved beneath the ice, then what does this mean for us, for our moment in history, for our civilization poised at what may be its own moment of decision between continuity and catastrophe? The pattern we have traced, the pattern the Sumerians encoded in their king lists, the pattern the Hindu sages preserved in their yuga cycles, the pattern embedded in flood myths around the world. This pattern suggests something both humbling and hopeful. Humbling because it means we are not unique. We are not the first to achieve sophistication and complexity and the illusion of permanence. Others came before us, rose to heights we cannot measure, and fell to causes we cannot fully reconstruct. The ice caps that now seem eternal have advanced and retreated multiple times through Earth's history. The coastlines that now define continents have risen and fallen with the ice. The climate that now seems stable enough to build global civilization upon has shifted, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically, in ways that would remake the world beyond recognition. We live in an interglacial period, a warm interval between ice ages, and interglacial periods do not last forever. The forces that shape climate, orbital variations and ocean currents, and volcanic activity, and the concentration of gases in the atmosphere, these forces operate on timescales that dwarf human history, and they do not consult human preferences before they shift. Our civilization, with all its achievements and complexities and billions of interconnected lives, exists within a window of climate stability that will not remain open indefinitely. This is not speculation. This is the testimony of ice cores and sediment layers, and the fossil record and every other method we have for reading Earth's history. The ice has advanced before. The ice will advance again. Or the warming we have triggered will push the climate into states unknown in human experience, flooding coastlines, disrupting agriculture, forcing migrations on scales that would strain any political or economic system to breaking. Either way, the assumption that our civilization will continue indefinitely on its current trajectory, that our children's children's children will live in a world recognizably similar to our own, this assumption is not supported by history, geological or human. And yet, and here is the hope embedded in the humbling, the pattern also shows that something survives. The Sumerians preserved knowledge from before their time. The map makers copied charts they did not fully understand. The flood myths retained the memory of catastrophe across millennia of retelling. Whatever came before, whatever rose and fell in cycles we can only dimly perceive, something was passed forward. Seeds, literal and metaphorical. Techniques for working stone and metal and earth. Stories that encoded truths in forms memorable enough to survive oral transmission across countless generations. The knowledge of the stars, of the seasons, of the patterns that govern survival. This is what the cyclical view offers, not despair at the inevitability of collapse, but recognition that collapse is survivable, that knowledge can bridge the dark times, that humans have faced the ending of worlds before and emerged to build again. The question is not whether catastrophe will come. History suggests it will in one form or another, on one timescale or another. The question is what we preserve, what we encode for the survivors to find, What fragments of our knowledge and our wisdom we embed in forms durable enough to outlast whatever disruption awaits. The ancient cartographers did this, perhaps without fully understanding what they were doing, by copying maps whose sources they could not identify, preserving knowledge they did not possess the technology to have created independently. The Sumerians did this by pressing impossible numbers into clay tablets, encoding something, whether astronomical cycles or memories of longer-lived predecessors, or something else entirely, that would survive millennia of political upheaval and cultural change and the rise and fall of empires built on the ruins of their cities. The Egyptians did this by building in stone at scales that still defy easy explanation, embedding mathematical constants in proportions that would be recognized by anyone with basic geometry, regardless of the language they spoke or the gods they worshipped. We can do this too. We must do this if we take the pattern seriously. If we accept that our civilization is not immune to the forces that have ended every other civilization before it. What will we preserve? What will we encode in forms durable enough to survive fire and flood and ice and time? What messages will we leave for the 7th civilization, or the 8th or the 20th, whoever emerges from whatever catastrophe awaits to dig through our ruins and wonder who we were and what we knew? These are not abstract questions for future generations to answer. These are questions for now, for us, for this civilization in this moment of precarious complexity and unprecedented power and profound vulnerability. The ice is melting. The climate is shifting. The forces that have reset the world before are still operating, and we have added new forces of our own making. What we do in the next decades will determine not just whether our civilization survives, but what survives us if it does not. Let this sink into you now as you drift towards sleep, not as anxiety, not as despair, but as awareness. You are part of a chain stretching backward into deep time and forward into a future you will not see. What you preserve matters. What you pass forward matters. What you encode in story and stone, and the memories of those you teach. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe. This is how the cycle continues. This is how humanity persists across the endings and beginnings of worlds. Let us return now to where we began, to that single piece of gazelle skin parchment resting under glass in a Turkish museum, the Piri Reis map with its faded ink and its impossible coastlines, its meticulous annotations in Ottoman Turkish, explaining that the admiral copied from sources far older than himself, sources that traced back through Byzantine archives and Alexandrian collections to origins he could not name, because even he did not know where the knowledge first came from. Whether those original surveys were conducted by a maritime civilization we have forgotten, by survivors of some catastrophe that reshaped the world, by beings whose very existence challenges everything. We think we know about human history, or whether by some cosmic coincidence, medieval cartographers stumbled upon accurate representations of a continent they had never seen and could not possibly have surveyed. The maps encode something real. The coastlines match. The subglacial topography corresponds. The rivers flow where radar now confirms ancient waterways existed beneath miles of ice. Something is being preserved in these documents, something that passed through the destruction of libraries and the collapse of empires and the long dark centuries when knowledge flickered like a candle in the wind, always nearly extinguished, but never quite going out. Think of the chain of hands that touched this knowledge. The anonymous scribes in Alexandria who copied crumbling scrolls onto fresh papyrus, understanding perhaps the navigational mathematics, but not the deeper implications of what they preserved. Think of the scholars who fled Constantinople as it fell in 1453, carrying what documents they could into exile, fragments of a world that was ending. Think of Piri Reis himself, an admiral and a cartographer, but also a compiler, a gatherer of sources, someone who knew that the documents before him contained something precious, even if he could not verify their ultimate origins. Think of the Turkish officials who rediscovered the map in 1929 while cataloguing the Topkapi Palace archives, who recognized that the gazelle's skin with its strange coastlines deserved preservation, even though they could not explain its accuracy. Think of Charles Hapgood and his students measuring and calculating and corresponding with the United States Air Force, trying to understand how a 16th century document could show what 20th century satellites were only beginning to reveal. Each link in this chain preserved something they did not fully understand, passed forward knowledge that exceeded their own comprehension, trusted that future generations would find meaning in what they themselves could only wonder at. This is how wisdom survives catastrophe. Not through complete understanding passed intact from teacher to student, but through fragments, through partial preservation, through the stubborn human impulse to save what seems important, even when we cannot articulate why. The maps remember because humans chose to remember, chose to copy, chose to preserve, yet chose to honor the work of those who came before, even when that work seemed impossible or mythological or simply beyond explanation. And now, imagine yourself standing on Antarctic ice, not the coastal margins where research stations cluster and penguins waddle across rocky shores, but deep in the interior, at the heart of the frozen continent, where the ice sheet rises 2 miles thick and nothing moves except wind and time. Beneath your feet lies a landscape no living human has ever seen directly. The Gambutsev Mountains rising like Alps entombed in crystal, ancient river valleys carved by water that last flowed when the world was young, lake beds holding liquid water warmed by geothermal heat and sealed from the surface for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps millions. What sleeps beneath this ice? The literal answer is stone and sediment and frozen time, rock formations that record epochs when Antarctica was green and forests covered the land and creatures walked beneath warm skies. The metaphorical answer is perhaps something more troubling, the possibility that beneath this frozen archive lies evidence of our own forgotten past. Structures built by hands like ours, artifacts preserved in cold so profound that organic material might survive intact across millennia. The testimony of a chapter in the human story that was erased by ice and time, but never entirely destroyed. The existential answer is a reminder that nothing on this planet is permanent, that ice ages come and go in cycles longer than any civilization has yet survived, that the frozen continent beneath your imagined feet was once temperate and will perhaps be temperate again, that the very concept of permanent ice is an illusion created by the brevity of human memory. And the hopeful answer is that knowledge survives, that whatever truths are encoded in those impossible maps, whatever memories are preserved in myths of flooded homelands and catastrophic resets, whatever secrets the ice is keeping, we are part of an ongoing chain of transmission, receivers of fragments passed down through millennia and potential preservers of fragments that will outlast us in turn. Feel the cold seeping through your boots, the silence pressing against your ears, the vast, indifferent weight of time crystallized into ice beneath you. Somewhere down there, below the wind and the darkness and the crushing weight of frozen centuries, something waits. Perhaps it is only geology, stone and ice, and the ordinary business of a planet cycling through its eons. Perhaps it is something else, something that remembers, something that was deliberately preserved for a future that had not yet arrived when the ice first descended. We cannot know tonight. We may not know in our lifetimes. But the question itself is part of the chain, passed from those who wandered before us to us, and through us to those who will wander after. Wherever you are listening to this, in whatever hour of whatever night, in whatever corner of the spinning world, you are part of something far older and far larger than your individual life. The same stars wheeling overhead watched those unknown surveyors charting coastlines that would soon vanish beneath advancing ice. The same human capacity for wonder that drove Piri Reis to compile his sources drives you now to seek out stories like this one, to lie in the darkness and let your mind wander across impossible distances of time and space. The cycles continue whether we understand them or not. Civilizations rise and fall and rise again. Ice advances and retreats. Coastlines appear and disappear. Knowledge is lost and found and lost again, preserved in fragments by stubborn humans who refuse to let the darkness win entirely. You do not need to solve these mysteries tonight. You do not need to decide whether the maps are genuine artifacts of a lost civilization or extraordinary coincidences, or something else entirely that our categories cannot yet contain. The questions themselves are gifts, invitations to wonder, doors left open for future generations to walk through. What matters is that you are here, that you listened, that you allowed your mind to travel across millennia and continents, that you became for a little while a link in the chain of those who wonder. Let your breathing slow now. Let the questions dissolve into the pleasant haze of approaching sleep. The maps will still be there in the morning, resting under glass in their museums, holding their secrets. The ice will still cover Antarctica, keeping whatever it keeps. The chain of transmission will continue, whether you dream of lost civilizations or ordinary things or nothing at all. You have done your part simply by wondering, simply by being present, simply by carrying these stories with you as you drift. If this journey stayed with you, if these ancient mysteries resonated in some quiet corner of your mind, a gentle light helps other wanderers find their way to these shores. More explorations wait in the darkness, more maps, more texts, more fragments of a past we are only beginning to understand. But those are for other nights. Tonight is for rest, for the peace that comes from accepting what we do not know, for the comfort of being part of something so much larger than ourselves that our individual uncertainties disappear into a greater pattern. Sleep well, dreamer. Dream deep. Now somewhere beneath the ice, the secrets keep themselves. Somewhere in museum archives, the maps wait for future scholars to unlock what we could not. Somewhere in the chain that stretches from the first human who looked up at the stars and wondered to the last, who ever will, you are here now, part of the story. That is enough. That is everything. Good night.